Welcome back, F11 members, to part 2 of the fundamentals of post-production video tutorials for issue 57, October 2016. Okay, in the first part we processed this image in Lightroom, really worked on the image to bring out its best. If we look at where we started, where we finished, a radical transformation that I'm really quite happy with. It amazes me actually what I'm able to bring back from what appears to be a totally burnt out sky. And that, of course, is the advantage of exposing images correctly. But what we're doing today, fundamentally, is looking at sharpening of the picture and determining just how much we need to apply. Sharpening is, in effect, taking a felt tip pen and drawing a line around discernible areas of the image where there is a hard edge, where there is discernible detail. It has the appearance of making the image look sharper. Although, if you have taken an image which is out of focus, or the camera was not stable while you're shooting it, nothing we can do here will rectify that. All we're doing is forcing pixels into line to make sure that discernible edges appear crisp and sharp. That's the way I think of it, and it works for me. Now if I zoom in on this image here, and I'm going to zoom in first, I'll go to 1 to 1, okay? So that's 100% magnification. That is the normal magnification that you would use to judge the sharpness of a picture. And what I've got here is it's sharp. There's Lightroom's default settings here for sharpening. So to illustrate a point, I'm going to start by taking all sharpening out of the image. And I look at that picture and it looks reasonably sharp to me, a little bit soft. So what does the sharpening slider do? Think of it as intensity. And if I move the sharpening slider to the right, the image looks progressively crisper. If I go all the way to the right, at this magnification, the image looks really much crisper, which is great. Fabulous. Okay, so I'll just add 150% sharpening. Surely the more the better. Well, if I come up here to 300% magnification and zoom into that, now you can see the downside of doing that. We get this horrible grittiness, almost looks like grain, granularity, whatever you want to call it, in the image, in the even tones. Really unsightly. Now if I come back on the slider again, that disappears until if I come right out on the image, there's lovely smoothness to the tones there, but the detail is suffering. Clearly we need some sharpening. How much? Well, let's go back to where we started, which was around about 45%. And if I hold down the Alt slider, actually, and now move the slider to the right, what it's doing is actually, let's come over here to this area here, converting the image to black and white, because generally speaking, it's reckoned to be easier to see the effect of sharpening without the distraction of colour. So that's all that's doing. And from looking at the image now up close, I'm looking at that far edge of Stanage edge on the skyline there. And I want some sharpening because without it, it definitely looks slightly soft. How much? Somewhere in the middle, clearly. I'm going to come back to about 50% sharpening. Come down now to the second slider here, which says radius. And what in effect we're talking about here is the width of the felt tip pen, the width of the tip that we're going to draw that imaginary line along. And actually now if I hold down the Alt slider again and move the radius to the left and to the right, you can see what I'm talking about. What we have appearing along that line up at the top of Standage Edge is what appears to be a black felt tip pen drawn along the edge, right next to a white felt tip pen drawn just above it. That is essentially what sharpening is doing, is boosting local contrast across discernible edges such as that to improve the appearance of sharpening. If I go all the way to the right, you can see it's quite a wide line it's drawing. It's way too much. And there's the effect. If I come to maximum sharpening and maximum radius, you can see up the top, not only have we got that horrible granularity to the image, but we've also starting to see almost a halo around edges, which it looks just ugly. Over-sharpening a picture ruins it. It looks horrible, and I see all too many pictures which have been over-sharpened. So, as always, with post-production, subtlety is the key. Finally, let's just bring back both sliders to the midpoint, round about there. With radius, I reckon round about 1 pixel is where we need to be. Let's look at this slider now, the detail slider. One of the hardest things to explain what it does. I've never really understood, quite frankly. I've asked the people at Adobe and I still have not got a satisfactory answer what the detail slider does. If anyone can explain it better, I'd like to hear from you. But essentially what it's doing is if I hold down Alt and move it right to the left, you can see it's not affecting anything, whereas if I go right as far to the right, it's affecting quite a bit of fine detail. So I think the best way to explain this is determining just how fine detail, how much fine detail the sharpening is affecting. And actually, you will know, hopefully from previous post-production video tutorials, that I tend to use this Lightroom preset, Sharpen Scenic, as a starting point for all my sharpening. If I click on that now, and it sets here, 40% sharpening, radius 0.8 pixel, with detail set at 35%. And that's really where I would start my go with my sharpening. If I come out to 100% now, that image does look nicely sharpened, nicely crisp at 100%, without any visible, horrible sharpening artifacts and halos visible. So I reckon that's a really good starting point. But the thing to do is finally, when we're determining our sharpening, is to understand that sharpening will introduce this granularity or grittiness into areas of the image that we don't want it to, even at these relatively modest settings here. And there's no point in sharpening areas of the image where there is no fine detail to be sharpened. So we can use this mask here. If I hold down Alt and move masking to the right, what we're seeing is the black is where a mask is being applied, so that only the areas that need to be sharpened are sharpened. And actually, I'm going to apply about 20% masking, so that just the area in the sky where the black was is where the mask is applied, and the rest is being sharpened. If I come out on the image here, there is a lot of detail in this image that needs to be sharpened. There's a lot of fine detail right from the foreground and all through the image, apart from in the sky. It really needs to be sharpened. So, where are we at with sharpening now? One thing you might care to consider is that sharpening and noise reduction are actually interlinked. If you sharpen an image, you bring in that grittiness, which is in fact noise. And what you could do is sharpen an image massively to really improve the detail, and then use noise reduction to take that back out again. But of course, what you're doing, one is cancelling out the other, in fact, and I can't, quite frankly, I just cannot see the point of that. So we all have different ways of working, but that's the way I do it, and I think it works for me. One thing I would like just to show you before we finish is if we look at the two images in Photoshop, and just give me 1 second. What I've got here open in Photoshop is two exports of the same image we've just been working on. And this image has been resized down to be suitable for web use, i.e. it's 1000 pixels across and 72 dpi. And that's just a good size for most web usage. The curious thing about sharpening is that actually if you're sharpening an image for large reproduction as a print, for example, you'll need less sharpening than you will if you're sharpening a picture for a small reproduction on a website. What I've got here in this image is on the right we have an image which has been output with very little sharpening done to it, and one that has used Lightroom's default sharpen for screen sharpening. If I just show you that here, if I now go into library module here and go export, you can see down here it says output sharpening. Now normally we've worked on this image in Lightroom, I'm finished with it, I've applied the sharpening, I'm outputting the master high resolution image. I would leave this box unticked because we've already applied our sharpening. But if I'm now making a small low resolution image for web use, I would click this, sharpen for screen. There you are, there's the options, and I'm sharpening for screen, and I'm going to ask it to apply the standard amount. Okay? Let's just cancel that and go back into Photoshop, and the two images are side by side. One has had that output sharpening for screen applied, the one on the left, the one on the right hasn't. And at this size, very difficult to see any difference, but the one on the left does look a little, just a touch more clarity. If I zoom in to 100% now, 200%, sorry, which is larger than we would normally be viewing them on a screen, but nevertheless you can see on the left there's just a touch more clarity to the one on the right. So you don't have to sharpen, of course, just in Lightroom. We can do it in Photoshop as well. So if I just close down the image on the left, and now I'm going to go Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and there are the controls that we had in Lightroom just applied for us in Photoshop. Now clearly I've got 50 pixels wide, which is way too much, so I'm going to come right down on that. I want around about 1 pixel radius, and how much do I want? Probably around about 30%. But this is doing it manually, and as I said, I find that sharpen for screen function in Lightroom's export menu very useful for making images for web use. Okay, it seems like quite a complex topic, but just to recap, let's go back into Lightroom. Let's go back to this image here that we've been working on in the Develop module. And as I said, I think Lightroom's preset Sharpen Scenic is a really good starting point to work from with your images. round about 40% with a 0.8 pixel radius and the detail slider at 35, and then fine-tuning using the masking tool here, hold down the Alt slider, to ensure that only the areas of the image that you want are being sharpened, and that works for me all the time. But it's always good to know what you're doing and to understand the theory, and hopefully we've achieved that today with these 2 video tutorials. Please do send in your ideas for future topics that you would like covered in these video tutorials. Coming up soon is the topic of focus stacking, and I would love to hear future suggestions from you. Okay, thanks, and we'll see you next month.